Welcome. Before we step into this disturbing true story, take a moment to tell me where you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because uncovering stories like this requires deep research, buried records, and countless hours separating myth from documented history. What you're about to hear isn't just a rumor or a ghost tale. It's a chilling account from 1855 that shook an entire plantation and left a permanent mark on everyone who witnessed it. She was known on the plantation long before the accusations ever began, but not for anything dark or forbidden. In the records, she appeared as a single name, spelled differently depending on who was writing it. But among the enslaved community, she was remembered for her quiet presence and sharp awareness. She had been brought to the plantation as a young girl, torn from the coastal region, where her people still whispered fragments of old African beliefs, mixed with forced Christianity. From an early age, she learned to observe more than she spoke. While others labored loudly under the overseer's watch, she worked in silence, listening, remembering, surviving. Those who knew her best said she had a way of noticing things others missed. She understood the rhythms of the land, the timing of storms, the way animals behaved before sudden changes. She could tell when illness was coming just by the sound of a cough or the color of someone's skin. When children fell sick, it was often her hands that cooled their fevered foreheads. When women struggled through childbirth, she was there, steady and calm, whispering reassurances learned from older women long gone. To the enslaved, she was protection in a world that offered none. To the plantation owners, she was useful, and usefulness often bred suspicion. She had never been taught to read, yet people swore she could recognize words on paper. She had never been formally trained as a healer, yet overseers would quietly send for her when their own medicines failed. This contradiction made people uneasy. The same men who relied on her knowledge were the first to question where it came from. In their minds, an enslaved woman was not meant to know things beyond obedience. Knowledge without permission was dangerous. The overseer, in particular, watched her closely. He was a man known for cruelty masked as discipline, someone who believed fear was the only way to maintain control. From the moment he arrived, he saw her not as a servant but as a threat. She didn't flinch under his gaze. She didn't beg. She didn't cry out when punished. That unsettled him more than open rebellion ever could. Her silence felt deliberate, as though she were holding something back. Whispers about her origins grew quietly. Some said her mother had been taken from a region where spirit practices were common. Others claimed she carried old blood, whatever that was supposed to mean. In truth, much of this talk came from fear rather than fact. When people cannot explain strength in the powerless, they invent darkness to justify it. The enslaved community, however, knew a different story. They said she had learned what she knew through survival, through watching people die, through listening to elders before they were sold away, through holding on to fragments of identity that slavery tried to erase. Still, even among her own people, there was caution. She warned others not to speak too openly about the old ways. Words travel, she would say, and they don't always come back the same. She knew the danger of being misunderstood, especially as rumors began to circle. In 1855, fear was as deadly as violence. Anything that challenged the overseer's authority could become a weapon used against its owner. The plantation records later described her as unusual, difficult to read, and not properly submissive. Those words would eventually be used to justify what came next. But before the accusations, before the whispers of summoning and spirits, she was simply a woman trying to survive a system designed to erase her. She had no power in the legal sense, no protection, no voice that mattered outside the quarters, and yet her presence lingered in people's minds long after she left a room. That presence, calm, knowing, unafraid, became the foundation of the legend that followed. When unexplained events began to unfold later, it was easy for fearful men to point back to her and say she must have been the cause. They ignored the truth that had always been there, that strength, when it cannot be controlled, is often labeled as evil. And so the story of the forbidden ritual did not begin with magic or spirits. It began with an enslaved woman whose origins, intelligence, and quiet resilience made powerful men deeply uncomfortable, and in 1855, that discomfort was enough to condemn her. The tension between her and the overseer did not erupt all at once. It built slowly, like pressure beneath the ground, invisible but inevitable. At first, their interactions were ordinary by plantation standards. Orders barked, work assigned, silence expected. But unlike the others, she never reacted the way he wanted her to. She didn't lower her eyes fast enough. She didn't rush in panic when he approached. She moved with a measured calm that made him feel watched instead of feared, and that unsettled him deeply. The overseer was a man who thrived on control. Fear was his language, and pain was the punctuation. He believed obedience had to be visible, trembling hands, bowed heads, broken spirits. But she offered none of that. When punished, she endured without crying out. When threatened, she met his words with silence. To him, that silence felt like defiance. Worse, it felt intentional. Things shifted the day he fell ill. It was nothing dramatic at first, just a sudden weakness, a trembling in his hands, a sharp pain behind his eyes. He dismissed it as heat exhaustion, but the illness lingered. His sleep became restless, filled with vivid dreams he couldn't explain. He claimed to see shadows moving in his room, shapes standing at the foot of his bed. When he woke, the air felt heavy, and the candles burned low, as if they had been drained too quickly. He needed someone to blame, and his gaze turned toward her. He began assigning her the hardest labor, watching closely for signs of strain or fear. Instead, she worked as she always had, steady, quiet, focused. That only fueled his anger. He accused her of spreading disobedience among the others, though there was no proof. He claimed she spoke in whispers at night, though no one could confirm it. Rumors began to grow, not because they were true, but because he repeated them often enough that others started listening. One afternoon, he confronted her directly. He demanded to know what she was hiding, what she was planning. She said nothing. Her silence stretched between them, thick and unbearable. He struck her then, not out of discipline, but frustration. Later, he would swear that when he did, a sudden chill passed through him, and for a brief moment, he felt dizzy, as if the ground had shifted. That moment haunted him. From then on, every misfortune he suffered, every headache, every nightmare, every sudden noise in the dark, became proof in his mind that she was responsible. The overseer's fear twisted into obsession. He began watching her constantly, convinced that she was doing something behind his back. He claimed to hear chanting near the quarters late at night, though others heard only insects and wind. He insisted strange symbols had appeared near his door, though none were found. the more he spoke of it, the more real it became to him. And in a place where power depended on belief as much as force, his fear became dangerous. The enslaved community noticed the change in him long before the accusations were spoken aloud. They saw how his eyes followed her, how his voice sharpened when he addressed her, how punishments became more severe without clear cause. Some urged her to be careful, to avoid him when possible. Others warned her that fear in a man like him always looked for an outlet. She listened, but there was nowhere to go. On a plantation, avoidance was a luxury no one truly had. What the overseer could not accept was that his authority was failing him internally. His illness had weakened his sense of control, and instead of confronting that, he projected it onto her. In his mind, she was no longer just an enslaved woman. She was a challenge to his power, a living reminder that there were things he could not command or understand. And in 1855, anything that could not be controlled was quickly labeled as evil. This growing tension laid the foundation for everything that followed. When strange events later occurred, when his health worsened, when accidents happened, when fear spread, it was easy for him to point to her and claim cause and effect. The narrative had already been written in his mind. All that remained was to convince others, and in a world shaped by cruelty, superstition, and absolute authority, his accusation did not need truth to survive. It only needed fear. The whispers began quietly, almost invisibly, passing from mouth to mouth in the slave quarters after long days of labor. At first, they weren't accusations, just fragments, half-remembered stories, old warnings, things people had been taught never to say out loud. Someone mentioned seeing her awake late at night, sitting near the edge of the quarters when everyone else slept. Someone else said they heard her murmuring softly, not loudly enough to make out words, but steady, rhythmic, like a prayer that didn't belong to Sunday sermons. In a world where every sound after dark carried danger, even quiet could become suspicious. Among the enslaved, these whispers were not born from fear of her, but fear for her. They knew how quickly harmless traditions could be twisted into something punishable. Many still carried traces of African spiritual practices, protective charms, whispered prayers, rituals meant to guard against sickness or grief. These weren't acts of rebellion or darkness, they were survival. But plantation owners and overseers did not see them that way. To them, anything outside their understanding was a threat. She had been taught by older women who were no longer there, sold away beaten, or buried without markers. They taught her how to remember without leaving evidence, how to pray without words, how to carry meaning in silence. If she practiced anything at all, it was done with caution. No fires, no markings, no objects that could be seized and used against her. Still, people noticed that when she was near, others felt calmer. Sick children slept more easily. Women said their nightmares eased. Those small changes, invisible to masters, became the foundation of rumor once fear entered the picture. The overseer's illness gave those whispers a new shape. Suddenly, harmless murmurs became chants. Quiet reflection became ritual. People claimed she knew when trouble was coming before it arrived. They said she warned others to stay away from certain places, and when accidents later happened there, it fed the story. Coincidence was no longer coincidence. Everything became evidence. At night, the quarters buzzed with anxious speculation. Some were afraid that association with her would bring punishment. Others believed she was protecting them in ways they couldn't explain. A few urged her to stop whatever she was doing, not because it was wrong, but because survival depended on being invisible. She listened, but she also knew something painful. Even if she stopped everything, the rumors would not. Once fear takes a shape, it does not need truth to continue growing. The most dangerous whispers came not from the enslaved, but from the white households nearby. One of the overseer's relatives claimed servants had been tampered with. A neighbor suggested the plantation was under a dark influence. The language grew dramatic, heavy with religious fear. Words like forbidden and unnatural began to circulate, even though no one could describe a single actual act. The idea of a ritual mattered more than proof of one. What made it worse was timing. Strange things were happening, animals behaving erratically, the overseer's health worsening, sudden accidents in the fields. None of it was connected in reality, but fear linked them together into a single narrative, and she, already isolated and watched, became the center of it. Every quiet moment she took for herself was now suspect. Every calm reaction was interpreted as guilt. She denied nothing and confessed to nothing, because there was nothing to confess. But in a system built on power, denial was meaningless. Silence was interpreted as secrecy. Knowledge was mistaken for sorcery. Survival skills inherited through generations were recast as dark practices meant to harm. The truth was far less dramatic and far more tragic. These forbidden rituals were never about summoning anything evil. They were about holding on to identity in a place designed to erase it. About coping with grief when there were no funerals. About protecting children when medicine was scarce. But once the overseer's fear merged with plantation superstition, the story no longer belonged to her. It became something larger, darker, and far more dangerous. By the time the accusations were spoken aloud, the whispers had already done their work. The idea of a ritual existed now, fully formed, even without evidence. And in 1855, on a plantation ruled by fear and control, belief alone was enough to destroy a life. The night everything changed arrived without warning, wrapped in ordinary darkness. There was no storm, no strange signs in the sky. Nothing dramatic to mark it as different from any other night on the plantation. That is what made it so terrifying later, how quietly it began. After the final work bell rang, the enslaved were locked into their quarters as usual. Lanterns were blown out one by one. The plantation settled into its familiar uneasy silence, broken only by insects and the distant creak of wood cooling in the night air. According to later accusations, this was the night the summoning took place. But the truth, buried beneath fear and rumor, was far less theatrical. That evening, she had been called to help an elderly woman suffering from violent convulsions. The woman's breathing was shallow, her body burning with fever, and no one else knew what to do. There was no doctor coming, no medicine, only Han's memory and desperation. She knelt beside the woman, whispering softly, not chants, not spells, but words of comfort, fragments of prayers passed down from women who had survived worse. She placed her palm on the woman's chest, steadying her breathing, focusing on keeping her alive until morning. But somewhere beyond the quarters, something else was happening. The overseer had not slept in days. His illness had worsened, turning his thoughts sharp and distorted. He claimed later that he woke suddenly that night, drenched in sweat, unable to move. He said the air in his room felt thick, pressing down on his chest. Shadows seemed to stretch along the walls, and he heard a low sound, not words, not voices, just a vibration that made his ears ring. Whether it was fever, fear, or guilt, no one could say. But in his mind, there was only one explanation. He staggered outside, convinced something was being done to him. A servant later testified that the overseer was muttering her name under his breath, over and over, as if repeating it would protect him. He claimed he saw a light near the quarters, though no one else saw anything but darkness. By morning, the story had already begun to change. The light became a fire. The whispers became chants. The act of tending to a sick woman became a ritual meant to summon something unseen. Fear filled the gaps where facts should have been. The overseer insisted that whatever he felt could not be natural. He spoke of pressure on his chest, of feeling watched, of a presence standing just beyond sight. These sensations, common in illness and panic, were reinterpreted as proof. The plantation owners listened carefully, not because they believed every word, but because belief gave them control. An enslaved woman accused of summoning an evil spirit was far easier to punish than an overseer admitting weakness. By midday, the narrative had hardened. It was said she had chosen the night deliberately, that she had waited until darkness to perform a forbidden act, that the illness afflicting the overseer was no coincidence, but a direct result of her actions. No one asked what exactly she had done. No one demanded evidence. The idea alone was enough. In a society ruled by superstition and power imbalance, accusation became reality the moment it was spoken by the right person. She was brought before the overseer that afternoon, still exhausted from tending the sick through the night. He demanded to know what she had done. When she said she had only helped someone who was dying, he laughed, not with humor, but with fear. "You think I don't know?" he said. "You think I didn't feel it?" His certainty left no room for truth. What haunted her most was not the accusation itself, but how easily it was accepted, how quickly the story spread beyond the plantation. By sunset, neighboring overseers were whispering about dark work. The word summoning was used for the first time, heavy with religious terror. It no longer mattered what truly happened that night. The version fueled by fear had already taken hold. That night became a fixed point in the plantation's memory, retold, exaggerated, sharpened with each telling. The quiet act of care was transformed into something monstrous. And once that transformation was complete, there was no way to undo it. The forbidden ritual was not defined by candles, symbols, or incantations. It was defined by power turning fear into accusation, by a system that could not tolerate an enslaved woman possessing knowledge, calm, or influence. And from that night forward, every strange event, every illness, every death would be traced back to her, all because of what men believed happened in the dark, not what truly did. The overseer's illness did not fade after that night, it intensified. What began as weakness and fever turned into something far more disturbing, at least in the eyes of everyone watching. He complained of crushing headaches that came without warning, pain so sharp it forced him to his knees. His hands trembled constantly, and sometimes he stared at them in confusion, as if they no longer belonged to him. Sleep abandoned him almost entirely. When he did drift off, he woke screaming, convinced something had been standing over him, breathing close to his face. He began behaving erratically in daylight as well. His temper, already cruel, became unpredictable. He lashed out at workers for imagined slights, then moments later stood silent, staring into nothing. On several occasions, he stopped mid-sentence, clutching his chest, insisting his heart was being squeezed from the inside. The plantation doctor could find no clear cause. There was no sign of poison, no injury, nothing that explained the rapid decline. That uncertainty frightened everyone more than a diagnosis ever could. The overseer himself was convinced there was only one explanation. He claimed that since the night of the alleged ritual, he felt marked. He said the air around him felt wrong, that rooms grew colder when he entered them. He insisted that candles burned lower in his presence, that animals reacted strangely to him, horses refusing to be mounted, dogs growling for no reason. Each unexplained sensation became further proof in his mind that something evil had attached itself to him. Soon, others began to notice changes too. Servants whispered that his shadow sometimes seemed to lag behind him, stretching unnaturally along walls. A housemaid swore she heard him arguing with someone late at night, though he was alone in his room. When asked about it, he snapped that she was lying, then later punished her severely for spying. Fear spread quickly because the overseer's suffering did not make him weaker. It made him more dangerous. His illness became public knowledge when he collapsed in the yard one afternoon. Witnesses said he cried out, claiming he felt hands around his throat. He clawed at the air, gasping, while no one dared approach him. When he finally regained consciousness, his first words were her name. That moment sealed her fate. From then on, every symptom he experienced was spoken of as an attack, not an illness. The plantation owners began to frame his condition as evidence. They said a healthy man does not deteriorate so quickly without cause. They said doctors would have found something if it were natural. The idea that fear, guilt, and exhaustion could destroy a man from the inside was dismissed. It was far easier to believe in a curse than to confront the brutality of the system that was consuming its own enforcers. As his condition worsened, his authority slipped, and that terrified him more than death. He could no longer ride the fields as he once did. His voice shook when giving orders. Workers noticed his weakness, and even that awareness felt dangerous. To reclaim control, he leaned harder into the accusation. If he could not dominate through strength, he would dominate through fear. He began telling anyone who would listen that she had sent something. After him, he described sensations that sounded less like possession and more like panic, tight chest, racing thoughts, distorted perceptions. But panic did not exist in the plantation vocabulary. Only sin, punishment, and evil did. Ministers were consulted. Neighbors whispered. The story grew sharper with each retelling. And through it all, she was never allowed to speak in her own defense. Her alleged act mattered less than his suffering. His illness became the centerpiece of the accusation, the proof that convinced others something unnatural had occurred. The fact that his cruelty, paranoia, and declining health could be connected was never considered. In the end, the overseer's unexplained illness became the foundation of the entire case against her. It transformed rumor into certainty, fear into justification. His body became the evidence, his pain the accusation. And once a powerful man's suffering was framed as the result of an enslaved woman's supposed actions, there was no outcome possible except punishment, because in 1855, an illness without explanation was far more frightening than the truth. Fear does not arrive all at once. It seeps in, quiet and patient, filling empty spaces left by uncertainty. After the overseer's illness became impossible to ignore, the plantation changed in ways that were difficult to describe but easy to feel. Conversations stopped when footsteps approached. Eyes lingered too long on shadows. People listened more closely at night, not for sounds they heard, but for sounds they feared might come. The accusation had not yet become official, but the hysteria was already alive. Among the enslaved, fear took on a familiar shape, the kind that tightens the chest and reminds you that survival depends on being unnoticed. People avoided her, not out of hatred, but terror. Standing too close to someone accused of dark acts could bring punishment. Speaking in her defense could be interpreted as guilt. Even meeting her eyes felt dangerous. She noticed the change immediately. Where once there had been quiet respect or cautious warmth, there was now distance. Silence followed her like a shadow. In the white households, fear transformed into something louder and more aggressive. The overseer's suffering became a daily topic of conversation. Each new symptom was retold with exaggeration, layered with religious language and superstition. His fever dreams were described as visions. His panic was described as proof. Wives whispered to each other that something ungodly was happening nearby. Children were warned not to wander too close to the slave quarters after dark. Rumors multiplied because no one could explain what was happening, and unexplained things demand stories. One person claimed livestock refused to drink from a certain trough. Another swore a mirror cracked without being touched. A field worker's sudden death from exhaustion was quietly added to the list of signs. Even though such deaths were tragically common, fear stitched unrelated events together until they formed a pattern that felt undeniable. Religion poured fuel onto the fire. Ministers were consulted, and sermons shifted subtly in tone. Words like judgment, temptation, and the devil's foothold appeared more often. No one named her directly at first, but everyone knew who was being referenced. The idea that evil could rise from within the enslaved population comforted those in power. It meant danger was external, not rooted in cruelty or injustice. As hysteria grew, logic collapsed. Evidence was no longer required. If something bad happened, it was traced back to her presence. If nothing happened, that too was suspicious. Calm was seen as cunning. Fearlessness was interpreted as confidence in dark power. There was no behavior that could absolve her, because the story no longer depended on her actions. It depended on belief. The plantation owners began discussing containment, not openly, not formally, but in careful language meant to sound reasonable. They spoke of protecting everyone else, of restoring order, of preventing further harm. The irony was brutal. The very system that inflicted daily violence now claimed to fear being threatened. Hysteria changed how people remembered the past. Moments that had once seemed ordinary were reinterpreted as warnings missed. Someone recalled her standing quietly during a sermon and decided she had been mocking it. Another remembered her refusing food one night and claimed it was part of a fast for a ritual. Memory bent to fit fear, reshaping itself until it supported the accusation perfectly. What made the hysteria so powerful was that it served everyone's needs except hers. It gave the overseer a reason for his suffering that did not involve weakness. It gave plantation owners an enemy that could be punished instead of questioned. It gave neighbors a thrilling story to whisper about. And it gave religion a convenient battle between good and evil that required no reflection. For the enslaved, hysteria was deadly. When fear takes hold among the powerful, punishment always follows. People braced themselves for collective consequences, longer hours, harsher discipline, fewer allowances. Some prayed the accusation would burn itself out. Others feared it would end in blood. No one believed it would end quietly. She became the center of a storm she could not see or control. Every breath she took was now interpreted. Every movement was watched. Even her silence was used against her. And as hysteria peaked, something irreversible happened. The plantation no longer needed proof. Fear had done its work. By the time officials and authority figures became involved, their decisions were already made. They stepped into a narrative fully formed by rumor and terror. What began as whispers had become certainty. What began as illness had become evil. Plantation fear and hysteria did not erupt because of a ritual. They erupted because power felt threatened by something it could not understand. An enslaved woman with knowledge, calm, and influence in a world that demanded her submission. And once that fear took root, it spread faster than truth ever could, sealing her fate long before any judgment was spoken aloud. The decision to punish her was never officially announced as justice. It was framed as necessity. By the time accusations hardened into action, the plantation had convinced itself that stopping the supposed curse mattered more than truth. The language used was careful, almost polite. They said it was for everyone's safety. They said it was temporary. They said it was meant to cleanse the situation, not to destroy her. But everyone understood what punishment meant in a place where power ruled unchecked. She was taken from the quarters before dawn, when darkness still offered a thin illusion of mercy. No explanation was given to her, because explanations were not required. Shackles were unnecessary. Fear did the work of iron. She was brought before the overseer, whose face had grown gaunt and hollow. His eyes no longer held authority, only desperation. He demanded she confess, not because he needed the truth, but because confession would give his suffering meaning. She told him again that she had harmed no one, that she had only tried to help the sick. Her voice did not shake, and that calm infuriated him. To the fearful, composure looks like defiance. He accused her of hiding knowledge, of calling on forces she refused to name. When she remained silent, he claimed that silence proved guilt. The logic was impossible to escape. The first punishment was isolation. She was confined to a small, windowless structure near the edge of the property, away from the quarters. Isolation served two purposes. It removed her influence from others, and it allowed fear to grow unchecked by her presence. From that moment on, people could imagine anything happening inside that space. The unknown became evidence. Ministers were brought in, men who claimed spiritual authority but understood nothing of her world. They prayed loudly outside her confinement, demanding she repent. They spoke of darkness, possession, and repentance, but never once asked what she believed or what she had done. When she did not cry out or beg, they grew more convinced something was wrong. In their eyes, fearlessness was not strength, it was proof of corruption. Attempts were made to break whatever power they believed she held. She was denied sleep, questioned repeatedly, and threatened with harsher punishment if she did not cooperate. They wanted names, methods, details of a ritual that never existed. Each time she said she had nothing to give, frustration turned into cruelty. They were not punishing an act anymore. They were punishing the absence of one. The overseer's condition did not improve. In fact, it worsened. This terrified everyone. If punishment did not stop the curse, then perhaps it was not severe enough. That belief escalated everything. Fear demanded results, and results demanded suffering. The logic was circular and brutal. If she suffered, and he did not recover, they claimed she was resisting. If she suffered, and he showed brief improvement, they claimed it proved the punishment was working. Either way, she lost. Rumors spread that she smiled during prayer, though no one could confirm it. Others claimed she spoke words no one could understand while confined, even though she was often alone. Each lie justified the next act. Hysteria had now crossed into violence disguised as righteousness. What haunted witnesses later was not just what was done to her, but how ordinary it felt while it was happening. People went about their routines. Fields were worked. Meals were eaten. Punishment existed alongside daily life, normalized by repetition. The enslaved learned, once again, that survival meant looking away. Looking too long could invite suspicion. Sympathy itself became dangerous. At some point, the plantation stopped talking about stopping the curse and started talking about ending it. The language shifted subtly. Containment became removal. Correction became finality. No one said exactly what that meant, but everyone felt the weight of it. And then, abruptly, the punishment stopped. Not because she was proven innocent, but because she was no longer useful to the narrative. The overseer either recovered enough to leave or deteriorated beyond caring. Accounts differ. What remained was silence. She was never returned to the quarters. No record explains where she went. Some said she was sold quietly. Others believed she died under confinement. A few whispered something darker, that they had gone too far and buried the truth along with her. The unresolved nature of her fate became part of the legend. The plantation never fully recovered its sense of order. Fear lingered, not of curses, but of what they had done in its name. People avoided the place where she had been confined. Ministers stopped mentioning the incident. It was as if speaking of it might awaken something, not supernatural, but human guilt. The punishment meant to stop the curse did not bring peace. It only exposed something far more disturbing: how easily fear can turn belief into violence, and how quickly a system built on control will sacrifice an innocent life to protect its own illusion of power. The aftermath of her punishment was quieter than anyone expected, but that quiet did not bring relief. Instead, it carried a weight, the kind of weight that presses into memory, making people see shadows in sunlight and hear whispers in the wind. The plantation seemed smaller, as if the air itself had tightened around the quarters where she had lived and the small structure where she had been confined. People moved carefully, their movements tentative, eyes darting toward corners and doorways. The fear that had justified her punishment now lingered like a shadow, infecting the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. Even after she was gone, unexplained events continued. Horses would refuse to enter the stables she had touched. Tools went missing in patterns no one could account for. Crops sometimes failed in one field while flourishing in another without reason. The overseer, whose illness had sparked the hysteria, claimed he could feel her presence long after she disappeared. He described sensations of being watched, of sudden chills in rooms where no windows or doors were open. Those around him interpreted it as either divine punishment or the proof that she had indeed summoned something unnatural. Fear transformed coincidence into omen. The enslaved community, meanwhile, struggled to reconcile their grief with survival. She had been a protector in many ways, a healer, a voice of wisdom, and suddenly she was gone. The stories whispered among them carried both sorrow and caution. They warned each other of the dangers of knowledge, of standing out, of being strong in ways that could be misread as power beyond their station. Her absence became a lesson as much as it was a tragedy. For the overseer and the plantation owners, the incident did not end. Gossip spread beyond the plantation, carried by traders, visitors, and neighbors. Other plantations began to treat the story as cautionary, a tale about the dangers of defiance, magic, and the unknown. In a culture that thrived on fear and obedience, the story became legend, a narrative designed to remind everyone of the consequences of stepping outside the boundaries imposed by slavery. The enslaved, of course, knew the story differently. It was not about magic or evil, but about survival in a world that demanded submission at any cost. Historians later attempting to reconstruct the events encountered a patchwork of accounts. Some detailed illness and hysteria among the white overseers. Others recounted acts of punishment or confinement. Almost all mentioned her silence and composure, qualities that had so unnerved the men in power. In every version, whether exaggerated or factual, she remained the center of attention, not because she had done anything truly supernatural, but because fear had made her into a symbol. The legend, as it developed over the years, magnified the events of that one night into a story of dark ritual and supernatural influence. Each retelling added layers: candles, chants, whispered incantations, and unexplainable phenomena. These details were not documented at the time. They were reconstructed from imagination and fear. Yet they became inseparable from her memory, shaping the way later generations perceived her. To many, she was no longer a woman who lived and worked on the plantation. She had become something larger, an embodiment of mystery and dread. Even the physical space she once occupied became charged with memory. Locals claimed that the quarters where she had lived carried a strange energy, that animals avoided the area, that wind sounded different among the trees there. People passing through felt uneasy, though they could not name why. That fear reinforced the story. The land itself seemed to testify to what had happened there, as if reality had absorbed the terror of those who had lived it. Over time, the lesson of the incident shifted from punishment to caution. For the enslaved, it was a warning about the dangers of visibility and knowledge, about how even acts of care and survival could be twisted into accusations of evil. For the overseers and plantation owners, it became a story of dominance, a justification of their power over life, death, and truth. And for the outside world, it became a haunting tale, repeated in whispers, journals, and later folklore, growing more elaborate with each generation. Ultimately, the unresolved nature of the story, her fate unknown, the alleged rituals never confirmed, the overseer's illness unexplained, gave it a lasting power. Fear had done what punishment could not. It made the story eternal. The plantation returned to routine, but nothing returned to normal. The echoes of that night persisted, a reminder of how easily fear can create monsters from ordinary people, how accusations fueled by hysteria can destroy a life, and how legends are born when the truth is impossible to speak aloud. Even decades later, people traveling near the old plantation would whisper of shadows, of sudden chills, and of a presence that seemed to linger in the corners. No one could prove anything, yet no one could deny it either. The story survived, not because it was supernatural, but because it carried a lesson that no one wanted to forget. Fear is contagious, power is ruthless. And sometimes the most ordinary acts of survival can be mistaken for something far darker than they ever were.